Hello, welcome to tonight's story. Today we will uncover what it was really like in an American Civil War camp and more. Let's begin. The year is 1863. The air smells of wood smoke, sweat, and wet wool. Campfires crackle in the chill of an early morning near the Rappahannock River, and somewhere among the tired groans of grown men waking to another day of war, a boy rises too, barely 13. His hands are blistered. His uniform doesn't quite fit, and strapped to his chest is a drum nearly as large as his torso. Drummer boys in the American Civil War weren't just patriotic mascots, they were working soldiers. And for many, their jobs were far more grueling, dangerous, and soul-wrenching than anyone ever warned them. Too young for war, but not too young to march. At the start of the Civil War, thousands of underage boys enlisted, some as young as 9 or 10. Technically, the Union Army had age limits, 18 to carry a weapon, 16 for musicians. But reality often bent. Boys lied about their age, recruiters looked the other way, and desperate parents sometimes offered their sons up, believing the drum course would be safer than the rifle line. They were wrong. Drummer boys weren't sent into battle with rifles, but they marched alongside the men who were. Their role? Critical. Their drumbeats set the pace of marches, signalled commands in the chaos of battle, and kept units in step when officers' voices couldn't be heard over cannon fire. Drums, not just for rhythm, but for orders. Before modern radios, battlefields ran on sound, bugles, whistles, and drums. A specific rhythm might mean advance, another fall back. A long roll might signal a charge, so these boys had to be precise, memorize dozens of commands. And they had to be loud, drumming through gunfire, smoke, and screaming men. If a drummer misplayed a call, soldiers might run the wrong way, or die trying. They weren't just musicians. They were communication systems with beating hearts. Waking before the sun, sleeping with the dead, life in a Union camp was no picnic. Drummer boys woke before dawn, often the very first to rise, beating the reveille to rouse an entire regiment. They fetched water, cleaned uniforms, delivered messages for officers. Some ran drills all day, others trained with weapons, just in case. At night they played taps, the haunting melody we now associate with military funerals. But back then, it was a lullaby in hell. Many drummer boys admitted to crying themselves to sleep after playing it, knowing they'd have to play it again the next day for someone they knew. The myth of safety and the bloody reality. The romantic idea that drummer boys were safe from danger couldn't have been more wrong. They marched with the front lines, and while some officers tried to protect them, others treated them like expendable gear. Drummers were often the first shot at, not because they posed a threat, but because silencing the drummer would throw a whole unit into confusion. And then there was Frederick Grant, son of Ulysses S. Grant. Though technically just a boy, he witnessed bloody campaigns alongside his father, and later said that what he saw aged him more than years ever could. Some boys weren't as lucky. A 12-year-old Union drummer named William Black was struck in the face by shrapnel. He lived but lost his arm. Others died on the spot, their drums splintered, their names forgotten. A drum can't stop a bullet, but it can break a heart. The drum itself was often the heaviest thing these boys carried. A full military drum could weigh up to 40 pounds, especially with brass fittings and sticks. When wet, it got heavier. On muddy roads or frozen fields, that weight turned into torture. Many boys collapsed from exhaustion. Others developed chronic injuries. twisted backs, permanent hearing loss, deformed shoulders. There were no medics for drummer boys, no pensions, no protections, and if one died in battle, his drum might be packed up, sent home with a letter, or looted by enemy soldiers as a grim trophy. Stories that echoed, some drummer boys became legends. John Clem, known as the drummer boy of Chickamauga, supposedly shot a Confederate colonel with a musket too large for his hands. He later became a general, but most didn't. Most were ordinary children caught in the machinery of war. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to survive. Letters from the time reveal their fear, their boredom, their longing for home. "Mother," one boy wrote, "the men here are kind, but the cannon is loud. I sleep with the drum so I don't forget who I am." The sound that lingers. By war's end, thousands of drummer boys had served in blue and grey. Some came home missing limbs. Some came home never speaking again. Others never came home at all. But their drums, their rhythms, still echo in history, in reenactments, in military funerals, in museum displays where dented brass and worn sticks sit behind glass. And if you close your eyes and listen closely, in the distant roll of thunder or the beat of your own heart, you might just hear the faint cadence of a boy marching into battle, a child wrapped in the sound of war, and silence. It was spring 1865. The Civil War was finally beginning to wither, its final embers flickering in the ashes of too many burned fields and blood-soaked hospital tents. But for one woman, the war was never just strategy and surrender. For Clara Barton, it was faces, names, bones buried under the wrong initials, mothers who never got to say goodbye. She had made it her mission to find them all. But among the thousands of letters she received from desperate families and missing soldiers, one stood out, a letter that arrived with no postmark, no envelope, and no explanation, just a scrap of paper and a message from someone long dead. Who was Clara Barton? Before the war, Clara Barton was a quiet school teacher and clerk, known more for her shyness than for any military ambition. But when the first wounded soldiers stumbled home from the Battle of Bull Run, something inside her changed. She became, as many would later call her, the angel of the battlefield. No official title, no uniform, just a relentless determination to follow the war to its bloodiest fronts, bringing bandages, soup, and sanity to the broken men left behind. She was shot at, nearly crushed by cannonballs. She worked by lantern light in field hospitals so unspeakably filthy that rats ran across the floors and limbs were tossed like kindling outside. But Clara stayed, again and again, the missing soldier's office. By 1865, as the war wound down, Clara opened a modest office in Washington, D.C., dubbed the Missing Soldier's Office. Her goal? To help families find their lost sons, fathers, brothers. She published names in newspapers, sent investigators to former battlefields, cross-referenced dog tags with burial trenches. At one point, over 63,000 letters flooded her small desk. She responded to them all, personally. But then came the strange one. The letter with no return address. According to surviving stories and Clara's own notes, she received a folded piece of parchment one morning. It was old, faded, as though it had been written years before and only now delivered. It read, "Tell my mother I did not run. I held the line. The chaplain said I died brave. I was not afraid. HWS, Antietam, September 17, 1862. Clara blinked. HWS. She checked her ledgers. There were dozens of H's, a few Henry W. entries, but none listed as confirmed dead at Antietam, no one with those initials, no known sender, and the letter had no envelope, just the folded sheet, like someone had carried it by hand. But here's the thing, she recognized the handwriting. She had seen it before. The boy from Antietam years earlier, in 1862, Barton had worked through the night at the Battle of Antietam, still the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. Over 22,000 killed, wounded, or missing in less than 12 hours. One of the boys she treated had been struck in the leg and bled heavily, barely 16. His name was Henry Weston Sharp, HWS. He was pale, feverish, and kept asking if someone had told his mother he hadn't deserted, that he held the line, that he'd been brave. Clara comforted him as best she could. She thought he might survive. But by the time she returned the next morning, he was gone, removed from the tent. No record of where, no grave, just missing. She had never found out what became of him until the letter. How did the letter appear? To this day, no one knows. Some say a former soldier found it in a Bible and decided to forward it anonymously. Others believe it was slipped under her office door late one night. But the most enduring rumour, that no one delivered it at all, that Barton found it resting atop her desk one morning, with no one else in the office, the ink still damp, a ghost's final message. The haunting that followed. Clara never claimed to believe in ghosts, but those closest to her noted a change after that spring. She worked more quietly, sat longer by the windows. Sometimes she'd murmur, "I told her." I told his mother. And her colleagues noticed she'd begun to light a candle every September 17th, Antietam's anniversary. In her private diary, a single line appears beneath that year. "He found me, and I found her. That is enough." She never revealed who she was. History, myth, or message from beyond? Skeptics argue the letter was a fabrication, maybe even written by Barton herself, in a moment of grief or burnout, a coping mechanism. But others, especially those who worked alongside her, believed it was real. One nurse later said, "You could feel it. Something came with that paper. You didn't have to read it to know it was sacred." The original letter has since vanished. Some say it was buried with Clara. Others think it was lost in the fire that consumed much of her original office. But whether ghost story or forgotten document, the letter of HWS still circulates in Civil War lore. Clara Barton went on to found the American Red Cross. But she never stopped searching. Even in her 70s, she continued field work, helping identify the dead long after the last gunshot faded. Some say that final letter drove her, that she felt, in some invisible way, obligated to those who still had messages to send. And, perhaps, there are still letters like it. In trunks, in attics, in old family Bibles. Words never delivered, goodbyes never spoken, written in dirt, blood, or love. And maybe, just maybe, one day they'll find their way to someone like Clara again. Someone who will read them and remember. The year was 1865, and the Confederacy was unravelling like a frayed grey uniform. Richmond had fallen, Lee had surrendered, Jefferson Davis was on the run, and somewhere in the chaos, beneath canvas tarps and guarded by nervous soldiers, millions of dollars in gold and silver simply vanished. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to the Confederate treasury. All we have are clues, journal entries, conflicting testimony, and the persistent, tantalizing possibility that somewhere in the woods of Georgia, treasure still waits. The Confederate treasury, what was it? Throughout the war, the Confederate government collected hard currency, gold coins, silver bars, bank reserves, and foreign donations to fund the rebellion. But inflation, blockades, and battlefield losses made their money nearly worthless. Still, the hard currency they did manage to stockpile remained precious, guarded in banks, armories, and Jefferson Davis's own headquarters. By April 1865, the Confederacy's cash was being gathered from multiple sources into a final, desperate convoy. Jefferson Davis on the run. When Richmond fell, President Jefferson Davis fled south with his cabinet and what remained of the Confederate government. Alongside him was a caravan of wagons and trains laden with personal effects, military record, and the Confederate treasury. Reports say the amount included $500,000 in gold coins and bullion silver bars, Mexican pesos, and foreign banknotes, jewelry donated by Southern women for the cause, and possibly gold from the captured Dahlonega mint. They moved under cover of night, constantly rerouting, always under threat from Union scouts, bounty hunters, and even former Confederate soldiers hoping for a cut. The plan? Escape south to Georgia, then perhaps Florida, and eventually sail to Cuba or Europe to rebuild the Confederacy from exile. But they never made it. The disappearance in Georgia. Somewhere near Washington, Georgia, around May 1865, the trail goes cold. The treasury had been split among several wagons, hidden in false bottom carts, and heavily guarded. But by the time Union forces arrived to arrest Davis, most of the money was gone, vanished. Some coins were found scattered near a ravine, a few crates discovered buried under fresh earth, but the bulk never recovered. Rumours exploded. Who took the gold? Theories abound. Some say Confederate guards, unpaid for months, simply took what they could and melted into the woods. Others blame local bandits who ambushed the caravan as it staggered through Georgia. A few even accuse Union soldiers who supposedly found the wagons and confiscated the loot unofficially, then shared it in silence. But one of the most curious suspects, the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secretive Confederate sympathizing society rumoured to have taken the gold to fund a future Southern uprising. Legend says they buried it deep in the Georgia hills, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting for a second war. There is no proof, but treasure hunters still look. The lost cause and the lost coins. In the decades after the war, the South was left in ruin, but stories of Confederate gold spread like wildfire. Old men swore they'd seen wagons dumping chests into wells. Children whispered of shadowy figures burying coins beneath sycamore trees. Farmers dug up odd Spanish silver in fields where no battle had ever been fought. The town of Danville, Virginia, even briefly believed the gold had passed through its depot and dedicated a plaque to the mystery. Newspapers capitalized on the lore. "Confederate gold found in cave," screamed headlines, though no evidence ever held up under scrutiny. A haunting tale from the Blue Ridge, one of the eeriest legends, comes from a sleepy corner of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Locals there speak of 3 Confederate soldiers who camped in a valley, guarding a heavy chest. One day, 2 rode out for supplies. They returned to find the 3rd murdered, the chest split open, the gold gone. The murder was never solved, but hikers in that same valley claimed to hear the sound of metal chains dragging across stone and moaning in the fog, as though the slain guard still watches over the treasure he failed to protect. Superstition? Maybe. But the mountains don't forget. What if it was all spent? Of course, some historians argue the truth is far more mundane. By the time Davis was captured, the Confederate government had spent nearly every cent, paying off loyal troops, bribing guides, buying passage, or even distributing funds to widows and orphans. One ledger claims the treasury had been divided up and given to retreating Confederate leaders. There was no theft, it says, only desperation. But others note glaring contradictions, ledgers missing pages, soldiers who suddenly bought large farms post-war with unknown funds. Something doesn't add up. What remains today? Every few years, a new discovery sparks headlines. In 1975, a group in Georgia claimed they'd found Confederate coins buried beneath a ruined barn. Most turned out to be replicas. In the 1980s, a diver in a Florida swamp recovered a chest containing silver goblets and old banknotes, but no confirmed Confederate seal. And in 2017, a treasure-hunting documentary crew claimed sonar revealed a metal cache beneath a remote Georgian creek. But excavation was denied. The treasure, if it ever existed, remains hidden, or maybe it was never meant to be found. A symbol more than a fortune. Today, the missing Confederate gold is less about coin and more about closure. A symbol of how the South fell, scrambling, disjointed and full of unresolved reckonings. It's a mystery stitched into the fabric of American memory, reminding us that even in collapse, people will cling to symbols of hope, of resurrection, of fortune in the ashes. Somewhere in the woods, maybe under moss and magnolia, the treasure sleeps, or maybe it was spent on bread, bullets and bribes, leaving only stories in its place, stories that still shine like gold in the minds of those who listen. It's 1862. The war is no longer a distant thunder. It's on the doorstep, rattling windows, muddying gardens, and tearing families apart from within. In the heart of Georgia, South Carolina, or Virginia, the grand halls of southern mansions still echo with piano music and polite conversation. But the atmosphere is tight, brittle, like the china teacups balanced in trembling hands. Here, in the drawing rooms of the Confederacy's elite, the war wasn't always fought with bullets, but with glances, whispers, and the slow, simmering threat of betrayal. This is what it was really like to sip tea in a southern mansion during the American Civil War, where nothing was as calm as it seemed. The illusion of grace amid ruin. On the surface, many southern plantations clung desperately to normalcy. Silk gowns still swept over polished floors. Chandeliers still glittered. Parlor rooms hosted card games, poetry readings, and, of course, afternoon tea served in porcelain imported from France. But these rituals weren't about comfort. They were a performance, a way to deny the creeping dread just beyond the gate. Every cup poured was an act of defiance, every conversation a minefield, because while the tea cakes were sweet, the tension was sharper than any sabre. Divided houses, literally. In many elite families, not everyone supported the war, or even the same side. A woman might serve guests in grey coats and speak proudly of Southern independence, while secretly corresponding with a Unionist cousin in the North. Sons fought on opposing fronts. Fathers disowned daughters who married Northern men. Slaves whispered of freedom while folding linen napkins with shaking hands. One Virginia mansion was rumoured to host Confederate officers in the ballroom, while secretly sheltering escaped Union prisoners in the cellar. The lady of the house was never caught, but she never truly slept again. The power of polite conversation, tea in the South, was never just about refreshment. It was a weapon of diplomacy, a way to test loyalty. A visitor might casually mention a rumour. They say Sherman's forces are nearing Atlanta, and wait to see how the hostess reacts. Does she flinch, smile too broadly, change the subject? Each reaction could be damning. Saying too little marked you a sympathiser. Saying too much could earn you an arrest, or worse. Women especially walked a razor-thin line, expected to be patriotic hostesses, but also expected to spy, report, manipulate. In diaries, one Southern belle wrote, "We serve tea with grace, we lace it with lies, and we survive." The parlour as a battlefield. While men fought in trenches, the drawing room became its own battlefield of information and influence. Ladies hosted sewing circles where they stitched flags and gathered intelligence. House slaves listened carefully to visiting officers, later passing notes to Union scouts in exchange for promised freedom. In some households, invitations to tea were traps, a way for Confederate loyalists to test guests, eavesdrop, or even get someone arrested. The velvet settees, the sugar bowls, the delicate spoons, they were camouflage, and sometimes witnesses to deadly secrets, tension under silk. Women had to master their emotions. You might serve scones to a colonel who had your husband court-martialed. You might toast to the Confederacy while praying for its fall. There were moments when the mask cracked. One guest in Charleston reported watching a young hostess pour tea with shaking hands while her brother's empty boots sat in the corner, a quiet memorial no one dared mention. In New Orleans, Union occupation forced high society ladies to host officers in blue. They smiled, but later burned the linens they sat upon. Their rage wasn't loud, it was meticulous. The servants who knew everything in these mansions, the enslaved staff, witnessed it all. They fetched the silver, trimmed the candles, and served the tea, invisible but ever present. Many were literate, many could overhear strategy meetings. Some passed coded messages in laundry baskets or memorized troop movements from parlor discussions. They were not passive observers. Some historians credit the success of Union spies and scouts directly to the intelligence network formed inside these homes, people who risked beatings, death, and worse to quietly dismantle the institution that oppressed them. Even in the hush of the drawing room, revolution brewed. The longest afternoon. Not every mansion survived the war. Some were torched by Union raids. Others fell into ruin from lack of labour, supplies, or heirs. But the image of the Southern tea table, elegant, eerie, always on edge, has lingered in memory and myth. It's a scene of contradiction, a fragile calm painted over horror, a quiet stage where women held kingdoms together with sugar tongs and side glances, and beneath every lovely cup was the knowledge nothing would ever be the same again. The war after the war. Even after Appomattox, when surrender had been signed and the Confederacy lay in tatters, tea was still poured in those mansions, but now the faces had changed. Guests wore blue uniforms. The silver was tarnished. The walls bore bullet holes hidden behind portraits. And those who once used polite conversation as camouflage, many said nothing at all, because they remembered. They remembered who smiled too wide, who stood when the anthem played, who clenched their jaw when names were read aloud. Tea remained, but trust had vanished. That will be all for today's story. Thank you for joining me. I am so happy you are here.